Marcus Thompson had always been the class clown. Even at 25, working as a tour guide at Buckingham Palace, he couldn't resist making jokes to lighten the mood. His quick wit and easy smile made him popular among tourists, but some of his colleagues found his humor inappropriate for such a formal setting. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Marcus arrived at the staff entrance wearing his crisp navy uniform, his tour guide badge polished to perfection. He had been working at the palace for 3 years now, and the grandeur of the place still amazed him. The towering gates, the perfectly manicured gardens, and the stoic guards in their red tunics and tall black hats never failed to inspire awe in visitors. As Marcus prepared for his first tour group of the day, he noticed an unusually large crowd gathering near the main gates. A group of American tourists were taking photos with the Queen's Guard, trying to get reactions from the motionless soldiers. Marcus watched as one tourist after another attempted to make the guard smile, wave, or even blink. The guard, Sergeant William Hayes, stood perfectly still, his face expressionless beneath his bearskin hat. Marcus had seen this countless times before. Tourists always seemed fascinated by the guard's ability to remain completely motionless despite various distractions. He had developed a standard explanation about the guard's training and discipline that usually satisfied curious visitors. But today, something mischievous stirred within him. His tour group consisted of 22 people from various countries. There was an elderly couple from Japan who spoke limited English, a family with 3 young children from Australia, several college students from Germany, and a group of middle-aged women from Texas who seemed particularly excited about everything they saw. Marcus enjoyed the diverse mix of people he encountered daily, and he prided himself on being able to engage with visitors from all backgrounds. As they approached the Queen's Guard post, Marcus began his usual explanation about the Guard's duties and traditions. He spoke about their role in protecting the monarchy, their rigorous training, and the strict protocols they followed. The tourists listened intently, snapping photos and asking questions about the colorful uniforms and ceremonial weapons. That's when Marcus noticed young Tommy, an 8-year-old boy from the Australian family, staring intently at Sergeant Hayes. The boy seemed mesmerized by the guard's absolute stillness. Tommy's mother was busy taking photos of his sisters, not paying attention to her son's growing fascination with the soldier. An idea began forming in Marcus's mind. He had always been good at reading people, and he could see that this particular guard seemed especially stern today. Sergeant Hayes had a reputation among the staff for being particularly serious about his duties. Marcus had heard other guides mention that Hayes never smiled, never acknowledged jokes, and took his role more seriously than most. Marcus thought it would be harmless fun to see if he could get a reaction from the notoriously stoic guard. After all, what could go wrong with a little harmless entertainment for the tourists? His audience seemed ready for something memorable, and Marcus felt confident in his ability to keep things light and respectful. He stepped closer to the guard, maintaining what he thought was an appropriate distance. The tourists gathered around, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Marcus cleared his throat and began what he considered his most entertaining routine about the guard's legendary composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced with theatrical flair, "you're looking at one of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. These guards are trained to withstand any distraction, any attempt to break their concentration." He gestured toward Sergeant Hayes, who remained perfectly motionless. The tourists chuckled, and several raised their cameras in anticipation. Marcus felt encouraged by their positive response. He had performed similar routines dozens of times before, always managing to entertain his groups while maintaining respect for the guards and the institution they represented. But today felt different. Maybe it was the larger crowd, or perhaps it was his growing confidence after 3 years on the job. Whatever the reason, Marcus decided to push the boundaries of his usual performance just a little further. He began by mimicking the guards. Posture, standing rigidly at attention beside Sergeant Hayes. The tourists laughed at the comparison between Marcus's slightly shorter stature and the guard's imposing presence. Encouraged by their reaction, Marcus started making exaggerated facial expressions, contrasting his animated features with the guard's stone-faced demeanor. The German students found this particularly amusing, and their laughter attracted more onlookers. Soon, a crowd of about 40 people had gathered to watch Marcus's impromptu performance. He felt like he was on stage, feeding off the audience's energy and enjoying every moment of attention. Tommy, the 8-year-old boy, giggled, delightedly at Marcus's antics. His laughter was infectious, and soon other children in the crowd were pointing and laughing too. Marcus felt a warm sense of accomplishment, knowing he was creating a memorable experience for these families. However, what Marcus didn't realize was that his performance was beginning to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. In his enthusiasm to entertain, he was gradually moving closer to the guard and becoming more animated in his gestures. The boundary between harmless fun and inappropriate behavior was becoming increasingly blurred. Sergeant Hayes, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, but those who knew him well might have detected the slightest tension in his jaw. As a professional soldier with 15 years of experience, he had endured countless attempts by tourists and even some staff members to break his composure. But there was something about this particular situation that felt different, more challenging, to his authority and dignity. The crowd continued to grow, and with it, Marcus's confidence soared. He was completely unaware that his harmless entertainment was about to take a turn that would change everything. The laughter and applause from his audience masked the growing tension that was building beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent moment. As Marcus prepared for what he thought would be the climax of his performance, he had no idea that he was about to discover just how seriously the Royal Guards took their duties, and how quickly a moment of fun could transform into something far more serious than he had ever imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus reached what he considered the perfect moment for his grand finale. The crowd had swelled to nearly 60 people, all eagerly watching his performance beside the motionless Queen's Guard. Camera phones were held high, recording every moment of what tourists thought would be a charming interaction with British royal tradition. Marcus decided to attempt his signature move, something he had done successfully many times before with other guards. He would stand directly in front of the guard, mirror his posture exactly, and then slowly begin making subtle facial expressions while maintaining the rigid military stance. It usually drew enormous laughs from tourists and had never caused any real problems. He positioned himself about 2 feet in front of Sergeant Hayes, close enough for the dramatic effect, but what he believed was still a respectful distance. The crowd fell silent in anticipation. Marcus straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and assumed the same proud stance as the guard behind him. For the first few seconds, everything went according to plan. The tourists chuckled at the sight of the tour guide mimicking the soldiers. Perfect posture. Marcus began with subtle eye movements, looking left and right while keeping his body perfectly still. The children in the crowd giggled and their parents smiled warmly at what seemed like innocent fun. But then Marcus made a crucial error in judgment. Emboldened by the positive response and wanting to give his audience an even better show, he took a small step closer to Sergeant Hayes. Now he was standing barely 18 inches from the guard, close enough that his shadow fell across the soldier's polished boots. The change in the guard's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Sergeant Hayes's breathing became slightly more controlled, and the muscles around his eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. 15 years of military training had taught him to assess threats and inappropriate behavior with split-second accuracy. Marcus, however, was completely absorbed in his performance. He began making exaggerated, surprised expressions, widening his eyes and dropping his jaw in mock amazement at the guard's unwavering composure. The crowd's laughter grew louder, and several people called out encouragement for him to continue. young. Tommy pushed forward through the crowd, fascinated by what he was seeing. His mother, Sarah, was still busy photographing her daughters near the palace gates and hadn't noticed her son's movement toward the front of the gathering crowd. "Make him smile!" called out one of the German students, and others picked up the chant. "Make him smile! Make him smile!" The pressure to deliver an even more spectacular performance mounted. Marcus felt the weight of 60 pairs of eyes on him, all expecting something memorable. This was his moment to shine, to create a story these tourists would tell for years to come. He decided to up the ante. Marcus began making silly faces directly at the guard's impassive features. He crossed his eyes, puffed out his cheeks, and stuck out his tongue in increasingly ridiculous expressions. Each gesture drew bigger laughs from the crowd, and the sound of their appreciation was intoxicating. But what Marcus didn't realize was that each step, each gesture, each moment of increased boldness was being carefully noted by Sergeant Hayes. The guards' training included detailed protocols about maintaining dignity and respect around the palace grounds, and there were clear boundaries about what constituted appropriate behavior from both tourists and staff. The situation escalated when Marcus, riding high on the crowd's enthusiasm, made a decision that would change everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small squeaky toy he had bought for his nephew the previous weekend. It was a tiny rubber duck that made a high-pitched squeak when pressed. The crowd erupted in anticipation as Marcus held up the toy, showing it to his audience with theatrical flourish. Even from a distance, other palace staff members began to take notice of the commotion. Two other tour guides, Jennifer and Robert, stopped their own groups to see what was causing such a disturbance. Marcus positioned the rubber duck about 6 inches from Sergeant Hayes's ear and gave it a gentle squeeze. The sharp squeak rang out clearly in the morning air, followed immediately by delighted laughter from the tourists. Encouraged by their reaction, Marcus squeaked the toy again, this time holding it even closer to the guard's head. This was the moment when Sergeant Hayes made his decision. In his 15 years of service, he had tolerated countless minor infractions and inappropriate behaviors from overeager tourists. He had endured people trying to touch his uniform, make loud noises, and even attempt to place objects on his person. But there were limits to what could be overlooked, and those limits had just been crossed. The guard's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead throughout Marcus's entire performance, suddenly shifted downward to look directly at the tour guide. The movement was so unexpected and dramatic that several tourists gasped audibly. Marcus, still holding the squeaky toy, found himself looking directly into the stern, unwavering gaze of one of the Queen's most experienced guards. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The laughter died away as the crowd sensed that something significant had just happened. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the guard's attention was now fully focused on him, and the expression in those eyes was not one of amusement or tolerance. Sergeant Hayes's voice, when it came, was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Step back immediately," he commanded, his words carrying the full weight of military authority and royal protocol. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the children stopped their chatter, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Marcus stood, frozen, the rubber duck still in his hand as he processed what had just happened. This wasn't part of his routine. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. "I said step back," Sergeant Hayes repeated, his voice even more forceful than before. "Now." Marcus quickly stepped backward, bumping into Tommy, who had worked his way to the front of the crowd. The boy stumbled slightly, and his mother, Sarah, finally noticed what was happening. She rushed forward to collect her son, her face flushed with embarrassment and concern. The entire dynamic of the situation had changed in an instant. What had been a moment of light-hearted entertainment had suddenly become something much more serious. Marcus could see the disapproval in the faces of some tourists, while others looked confused about what had gone wrong. Jennifer, one of the other tour guides, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. She had been watching the situation develop with growing concern, and she could see that Marcus had crossed boundaries that should never be crossed. Her face was pale as she approached, knowing that this incident would likely have serious consequences for everyone involved. The seeds of what would become a much larger problem had just been planted, and Marcus was beginning to realize that his moment of fun might cost him much more than he had ever imagined. The silence that followed Sergeant Hayes's command was deafening. Marcus stood there, rubber duck still clutched in his sweaty palm, as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The crowd of tourists, who moments before had been laughing and encouraging his performance, now stood in uncomfortable silence, many looking away or shuffling their feet nervously. Jennifer approached Marcus with careful, measured steps. As a senior tour guide with 8 years of experience at Buckingham Palace, she knew the protocols and understood immediately how serious this situation had become. Her face was stern as she reached Marcus's side, but her voice remained calm and professional. "Marcus, please escort your group to the Victoria Memorial immediately," she said quietly. Her words meant only for his ears. "I'll handle the situation here." But Marcus was frozen in place, still staring at Sergeant Hayes, who had resumed his forward-facing position, but whose presence now felt monumentally intimidating. The guard's brief break in protocol to address Marcus directly had been significant, and everyone present seemed to understand that something important had just occurred. Tommy's mother, Sarah, had successfully retrieved her son and was now backing. Away from the scene, her face flushed with embarrassment. She whispered harshly to her husband, who had finally noticed the commotion and was approaching with their 2 daughters in tow. "What did that man do?" Tommy asked innocently, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet courtyard. "Why is the soldier angry?" Sarah shushed her son quickly, but his question seemed to echo the thoughts of many in the crowd. The German students, who had been so enthusiastic about the performance moments earlier, were now filming the aftermath with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that would make for compelling social media content. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing Sergeant Hayes directly. "I didn't mean any disrespect." The guard remained motionless, offering no acknowledgement of the apology. His silence was somehow more intimidating than any response could have been. Marcus realized that his words were falling on deaf ears and that the situation was far beyond the point where a simple apology could make things right. Jennifer took control of the situation with practiced efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had handled difficult situations before. "I'm afraid we need to continue with our scheduled tours. The Queen's Guard must be allowed to perform their duties without further interruption." Some tourists began to disperse, but others lingered, clearly hoping to see what would happen next. The elderly Japanese couple looked confused and concerned, while the Texas women were whispering animatedly among themselves their earlier excitement, now replaced with obvious disapproval. Marcus's tour group stood in awkward uncertainty. They had paid for a guided experience, but their guide was now clearly in some kind of trouble. The Australian family gathered their children close, with Sarah keeping a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder while shooting disapproving glances at Marcus. That's when Marcus noticed the approach of 2 palace security officers. They were walking purposefully across the courtyard, their destination unmistakably clear. His heart began to race as he realized that this situation was escalating far beyond anything he had anticipated. The first security officer, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, reached the group and immediately assessed the situation. His nameplate read, "Chief Inspector Morrison," and his presence commanded immediate respect from everyone present. "Mr. Thompson," Chief Inspector Morrison said, his voice calm but authoritative, "I need you to come with me immediately." Marcus felt his knees go weak. The use of his surname meant that this was already being treated as a formal incident. In 3 years of working at the palace, he had never been addressed so formally by security personnel. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "We'll discuss that in my office," Morrison replied. "Officer Williams will escort your tour group to the visitor center and arrange for another guide to complete their experience." The second security officer, a younger woman with kind eyes but a firm demeanor, stepped forward to address Marcus's confused tourists. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. We'll have you sorted with a new guide within just a few minutes." Marcus looked desperately at Jennifer, hoping for some sign of support or reassurance, but her expression remained neutral and professional. She had seen situations like this before, and she knew that any association with Marcus's behavior could potentially impact her own position. As Chief Inspector Morrison began to escort Marcus away from the scene, the tour guide caught one last glimpse of Sergeant Hayes. The guard remained in perfect position, as if nothing had happened, but Marcus could swear he detected the slightest hint of satisfaction in the soldier's bearing. The walk to the security office felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Other staff members they passed along the way looked at him with expressions, ranging from curiosity to concern. Word traveled fast in the close-knit community of palace employees, and Marcus could sense that news of his incident was already spreading. Chief Inspector Morrison remained silent during their walk, which only increased Marcus's anxiety. The security office was located in a less ornate section of the palace complex, away from the tourist areas and deeper within the administrative heart of the operation. As they entered the building, Marcus was struck by how different this part of the palace felt from the grand public spaces he was used to showing visitors. The corridors were narrow and functional, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on the institutional green walls. The security office itself was small and sparse, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and several filing cabinets. A single window looked out onto a service courtyard where delivery trucks occasionally made their rounds. Morrison gestured for Marcus to take the chair facing the desk while he settled into his own seat behind it. For several long moments, neither man spoke. Morrison opened a file folder and began writing notes, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the room. Marcus fidgeted with the rubber duck, which he still held in his hand, until Morrison looked up and extended his hand expectantly. "I'll need to confiscate that," Morrison said simply. Marcus handed over the toy, feeling foolish as he did so. The rubber duck, which had seemed like such a harmless prop just minutes earlier, now felt like evidence of his poor judgment. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, his tone professional but not unkind, "do you understand why you're here?" Marcus nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure he did understand the full gravity of his situation. "I think I may have gotten a bit carried away with my tour presentation," he said, hoping to downplay the incident. Morrison's expression didn't change. "What you did was interfere with a member of the Queen's Guard in the performance of his duties. That's not a minor infraction, Mr. Thompson. That's a serious breach of protocol that could have security implications." The word security hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never considered that his harmless joke could be viewed as anything related to security. In his mind, he had simply been entertaining tourists, doing his job as a tour guide in a way that made people happy. But as Morrison continued to explain the seriousness of the situation, Marcus began to understand that his perspective and the palace's perspective on what had happened were very different indeed. Chief Inspector Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus carefully. The silence stretched between them as he considered how to proceed with what was clearly a serious breach of palace protocol. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his actions finally beginning to settle on his shoulders. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, "in your 3 years of employment here, have you ever received training on appropriate behavior around the Queen's Guard?" Marcus nodded quickly, remembering the comprehensive orientation program all tour guides underwent. "Yes, sir. We covered the protocols during my initial training and in the annual refresher sessions." "And what do those protocols specifically State about interaction with the guards during their duties? Marcus swallowed hard, recalling the clear guidelines that now seemed glaringly obvious. We're instructed to maintain a respectful distance of at least 6 feet, never to attempt to distract or engage the guards directly, and to ensure that tourists understand the serious nature of their duties. Morrison made a note in his file. Yet today, you positioned yourself approximately 18 inches from Sergeant Hayes, used a noise-making device in close proximity to his person, and actively encouraged tourists to believe that attempting to break a guard's composure was acceptable behavior. Each point hit Marcus like a hammer blow. When laid out so clearly, his actions sounded far worse than the harmless entertainment he had intended. "Sir, I never meant any disrespect. I was just trying to make the tour more engaging for the visitors. I understand your intentions may have been good, Mr. Thompson, but intentions don't negate the impact of actions. Sergeant Hayes has filed a formal complaint about this incident." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. A formal complaint meant that this would become part of his permanent employment record. It could affect his career prospects not just at the palace, but potentially anywhere in the tourism industry. Morrison continued reading from the file. According to Sergeant Hayes's report, you deliberately positioned yourself in close proximity to interfere with the performance of royal duties, used a sound-making device as a form of harassment, and encouraged civilian bystanders to view the Queen's Guard as objects of entertainment rather than symbols of royal authority and national security. The formal language made Marcus's actions sound almost criminal. He realized that while he had been seeing the situation from the perspective of a tour guide trying to entertain his guests, Sergeant Hayes had been viewing it through the lens of a professional soldier whose duties were being compromised. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison closed the file and looked directly at Marcus. "That depends on several factors. This incident will be reviewed by the palace administration, and there will be consequences. The question is what form those consequences will take." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Morrison called for the person to enter, and to Marcus's surprise, Jennifer appeared in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "Chief Inspector Morrison," she said formally, "I was wondering if I could speak with you about the incident. This morning." Morrison gestured for her to enter. "Miss Patterson, what can you tell me about Mr. Thompson's behavior leading up to this incident?" Jennifer glanced at Marcus, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. She was clearly torn between loyalty to a colleague and her professional obligations. "Sir, I've worked with Marcus for 2 years, and I've never seen him behave inappropriately before today. He's usually very respectful of palace protocols." "But," Morrison prompted, sensing there was more to her statement. Jennifer took a deep breath. "But I have noticed that he's been pushing boundaries recently, making jokes that are perhaps a bit too casual for the setting, getting too friendly with tourists. I should have spoken to him about it before, but I didn't think it would lead to something like this." Marcus felt a pang of betrayal, even though he knew Jennifer was only being honest. Her words suggested that his behavior today wasn't completely out of character, but rather the culmination of a pattern he hadn't even been aware of. Morrison made more notes. "Were there any witnesses to previous incidents of inappropriate behavior?" "Not incidents exactly," Jennifer said carefully. "But other guides have mentioned that Marcus tends to be more theatrical in his presentations than most of us. Some tourists have specifically requested him because they heard he was more fun than other guides." This information seemed to particularly interest Morrison. "So Mr. Thompson has developed a reputation for pushing boundaries in his interactions with visitors?" Jennifer nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you could say that. But until today, it never crossed the line into anything that seemed problematic." Morrison turned back to Marcus. "Is this assessment accurate, Mr. Thompson? Have you been deliberately cultivating a more entertaining persona in your role as a tour guide?" Marcus realized there was no point in denying what was clearly evident to his colleagues. I suppose I have been trying to make the tours more memorable for visitors. Tourism is competitive, and people want experiences, not just information. I thought I was being good at my job. And did it occur to you that there might be reasons why other guides maintain a more formal approach? Marcus shook his head slowly. I thought they were just being unnecessarily stiff. I believed that making people laugh and enjoy themselves was a good thing. Morrison exchanged a look with Jennifer before continuing. Mr. Thompson, Buckingham Palace is not a theme park. It's a working royal residence and a symbol of British monarchy. The atmosphere we maintain here must reflect the dignity and respect that institution deserves. Entertainment is secondary to education and reverence. The weight of Morrison's words hit Marcus hard. He had been so focused on tourist satisfaction ratings and positive feedback that he had lost sight of the larger purpose of his role. He wasn't just a tour guide. He was a representative of one of the world's most respected institutions. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Chief Inspector, what will happen to Marcus? Will he be dismissed? Morrison considered the question carefully. That decision will be made at a higher level than mine. However, I can tell you that this incident will require a formal investigation. Mr. Thompson will be suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. The word suspended hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about his rent, his bills, his responsibilities. More than that, he thought about his family's reaction when they learned what had happened. His parents had been so proud when he got the job at Buckingham Palace. How long will the investigation take? Marcus asked. These things typically require 2 to 3 weeks to complete properly, Morrison replied. You'll be contacted when a decision has been reached. As the meeting concluded and Marcus prepared to leave the security office, he realized that his moment of what he thought was harmless fun had potentially cost him everything. The rubber duck incident, as he was already beginning to think of it, had transformed from a source of tourist laughter into the catalyst for the biggest crisis of his professional life. Walking out of the palace for what might be the last time, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how something that had seemed so innocent could have gone so terribly wrong. The following days passed in a blur of anxiety and regret for Marcus. He found himself replaying the incident over and over in his mind, analyzing every decision that had led to his current predicament. The suspension meant he was barred from entering palace grounds, and the sudden absence of his daily routine left him feeling lost and disconnected. On the 3rd day after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from his supervisor, Helen Richardson, the head of visitor services. Her voice was professional, but not entirely unsympathetic when she asked him to come in for a meeting to discuss the ongoing investigation. Marcus, she said, I want you to understand that this meeting is part of the formal process. You have the right to bring a representative with you if you choose. Marcus arrived at the palace administrative offices feeling nervous but hopeful that this meeting might provide some clarity about his future. The administrative building was separate from the main tourist areas, and he felt strange entering through the staff entrance knowing that his employment status was in question. Helen Richardson was a woman in her 50s who had worked at Buckingham Palace for over 20 years. She had a reputation for being firm but fair, and Marcus had always respected her leadership. She greeted him cordially and invited him to sit across from her desk, which was covered with files and documents related to his case. Marcus, I've been reviewing your employment record, and I want you to know that up until this incident, your performance evaluations have been consistently positive. Your tourist satisfaction ratings are among the highest in the department. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, Helen. I've always tried to do my best work. However, she continued, we've also been conducting interviews with other staff, members, and reviewing security footage from the past several months. What we've discovered is concerning. She opened a thick file and pulled out several sheets of paper. We found 3 previous instances where your behavior with tourists could be considered inappropriate, though none were reported at the time. Marcus's Heart sank as Helen described incidents he had barely remembered. There was the time he had posed for photos with a group of teenage visitors in a way that was deemed too casual. Another incident where he had made jokes about royal protocol that some observers found disrespectful. A third occasion where he had encouraged tourists to sing "God Save the Queen" in exaggerated accents that other staff members found inappropriate. In each case, Helen explained, the behavior was noted by other employees but not formally reported because it didn't seem serious enough to warrant disciplinary action. However, viewed as a pattern, these incidents suggest a consistent disregard for the professional standards we expect from our guides. Marcus listened in growing dismay as he realized that his reputation among his colleagues was not what he had thought it was. While tourists might have appreciated his entertaining approach, his fellow employees had been viewing his behavior with increasing concern. "I want to understand something, Marcus," Helen continued. "Did you receive feedback from other guides or supervisors about your presentation style?" Marcus thought carefully about the question. There were a few comments here and there, but nothing that seemed like serious criticism. Jennifer mentioned once that I might want to tone things down a bit, but I thought she was just being overly cautious. And did you consider that she might have been trying to help you avoid exactly the kind of situation you find yourself in now? The question stung, because Marcus knew the answer. He had dismissed Jennifer's gentle suggestions because he believed his approach was more effective at entertaining tourists. He had prioritized his own ideas about what made a good tour guide over the collective wisdom of his more experienced colleagues. Helen pulled another document from the file. "I also have a letter here from Sergeant Hayes himself. He's written a detailed account of the incident and his perspective on what happened." She handed the letter to Marcus, who read it with growing embarrassment. Sergeant Hayes had written in formal military language about the importance of maintaining dignity and respect around the Queen's Guard. He described how Marcus's behavior had undermined the solemnity that was essential to his role as a representative of the monarchy. "He feels quite strongly that your actions were not just inappropriate, but actively harmful to the institution he has sworn to protect," Helen explained. What struck Marcus most forcefully was a paragraph near the end of the letter where Sergeant Hayes wrote about the tourists who had witnessed the incident. He expressed concern that Marcus's behavior had taught visitors that it was acceptable to treat the Queen's Guard as entertainment, rather than as serious symbols of British tradition and security. "He makes a valid point," Helen said, watching Marcus read. "Tourism is important to the palace, but it must never come at the expense of the respect and dignity that these traditions represent." Marcus set the letter down, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of perspectives he had never considered. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted. "I genuinely believed I was making people's visits more enjoyable. I believe that your intentions were good, Marcus. But good intentions don't excuse poor judgment, especially when that judgment affects something as important as royal protocol." Helen then revealed something that surprised Marcus completely. "What you may not know is that your incident has had consequences beyond just your own employment. The palace has received complaints from some of the tourists who witnessed what happened. Apparently, several people were disturbed by what they saw as disrespectful behavior toward a symbol of British heritage." Marcus was stunned. He had assumed that the tourists had enjoyed his performance, but apparently some had been offended rather than entertained. The German students, he learned, had posted videos of the incident on social media with captions that criticized the lack of respect shown to the royal guard. "The palace's reputation is built on centuries of tradition and dignity," Helen continued. "Every employee here, from the highest administrator to the newest tour guide, has a responsibility to uphold those standards. When someone acts in a way that undermines those standards, it affects all of us." As the meeting continued, Marcus began to understand the full scope of how his actions had impacted not just himself, but his colleagues, the institution he worked for, and even the tourists he had been trying to entertain. The ripple effects of his moment of poor judgment were far broader than he had ever imagined. Helen finally addressed the question that had been weighing most heavily on Marcus's mind. The investigation is nearly complete, and a decision about your employment will be made within the next few days. I want you to know that your case has been reviewed at the highest levels of palace administration. The mention of highest levels made Marcus realize just how serious this situation had become. His rubber duck incident had apparently made its way up the chain of command to officials whose names he recognized from the news. 5 days later, Marcus received the phone call that would determine his future. Helen Richardson's voice was measured and professional as she asked him to come in for a final meeting to learn the outcome of the investigation. Marcus had barely slept for the past week, running through every possible scenario in his mind. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Marcus arrived early and sat in the waiting area outside Helen's office, watching other palace employees go about their daily routines. He recognized several faces from his 3 years of working there, but none of them acknowledged him. Word of his suspension had clearly spread throughout the staff community. When Helen called him into her office, Marcus was surprised to see that she wasn't alone. Chief Inspector Morrison was there, along with a woman Marcus didn't recognize, who was introduced as Margaret Ashworth from the palace's Human Resources Department. The formal setting made it clear that this was the final judgment on his case. Helen began by summarizing the investigation's findings. Marcus, we've completed our review of the incident and the circumstances surrounding it. We've interviewed multiple witnesses, reviewed security footage, and consulted with legal counsel about the appropriate response. Margaret Ashworth took over the presentation, reading from an official document. Mr. Thompson, the investigation has concluded that your actions on September 15th constituted a serious breach of conduct that violated multiple aspects of your employment agreement with Buckingham Palace. Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to listen carefully to every word. Specifically, she continued, you interfered with the duties of a member of the Queen's Guard, created a public disturbance that brought negative attention to the palace, and demonstrated a pattern of behavior that shows disregard for the professional standards expected of palace employees. The formal language made Marcus's actions sound almost criminal, even though he knew that no laws had been broken. The emphasis on pattern of behavior confirmed that the investigation had indeed uncovered his previous minor infractions. Chief Inspector Morrison spoke next. However, Mr. Thompson, we also acknowledge that you have no previous disciplinary actions on your record, that your tourist satisfaction ratings have been consistently high, and that several colleagues have spoken positively about your dedication to your work. This gave Marcus a glimmer of hope, though he tried not to let it show on his face. Helen took control of the conversation again. After considerable deliberation, the decision has been made that your employment with Buckingham Palace will be terminated, effective immediately. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Even though he had been preparing for this possibility, hearing it spoken aloud was devastating. 3 years of his life, a job he had been proud of, and his future in the tourism industry all seemed to crumble in an instant. But Helen wasn't finished. However, given the circumstances and your previous good record, the palace is prepared to offer you a different resolution if you're willing to accept it. Marcus looked up sharply, not understanding what she meant. Margaret Ashworth explained. We're prepared to allow you to resign voluntarily instead of being terminated. Your resignation letter would state that you're leaving to pursue other opportunities, and we would provide you with a neutral reference that confirms your employment dates and basic job responsibilities. The offer was unexpected, and Marcus realized it was actually quite generous under the circumstances. A resignation would look much better on his record than a termination, especially if he tried to find work in tourism elsewhere. Additionally, Helen continued, we're prepared to provide you with 2 weeks' severance pay, which is more than required given the circumstances of your departure. Chief Inspector Morrison added one final element to the offer. In exchange, you would be required to sign an agreement stating that you will not discuss the details of this incident with media or on social media platforms. This is to protect both your privacy and the palace's reputation. Marcus understood the implicit message. The palace was offering him a way to leave with some dignity intact, but only if he agreed to keep quiet about what had happened. It was a reasonable request, and one that actually protected his own interests as much as theirs. "I need to think about this offer," Marcus said, though he already knew what his answer would be. "Of course," Helen replied. "You have until the end of the business day to let us know your decision." As the meeting concluded, Helen asked to speak with Marcus privately. After the others left, her professional demeanor softened slightly. "Marcus, I want you to know that this outcome isn't what anyone wanted. You have talents as a communicator and educator, but you need to learn to channel those talents appropriately." She paused, then continued. "The tourism industry is full of opportunities for people who can connect with visitors and make their experiences memorable. But every organization has its own culture and standards. The key to success is understanding and respecting those standards, not trying to change them to fit your personal style." Marcus nodded, finally beginning to understand the lesson he should have learned much earlier. "I realize now that I was so focused on entertaining people that I lost sight of why they were really here. They came to experience something important and historic, not to watch me perform." "Exactly," Helen said. "A good tour guide helps visitors connect with the significance of what they're seeing. You have the skills to do that, Marcus. You just need to learn when and how to use them appropriately." That afternoon, Marcus called Helen to accept the resignation offer. He spent the evening writing his resignation letter, trying to strike the right tone of professionalism while acknowledging his own role in the situation. 2 weeks later, Marcus cleared out his small locker at the palace and said goodbye to the few colleagues who had remained friendly during his suspension. Jennifer was among them, and she offered him some final advice. "You're going to be fine, Marcus," she said. "This experience will make you a better guide in the long run. You just need to find the right place for your talents." As Marcus walked away from Buckingham Palace for the last time, he reflected on how much he had learned about himself and about the importance of understanding the context in which he worked. The rubber duck incident had cost him his job, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about respect, professionalism, and the difference between entertaining people and serving them. 6 months later, Marcus found work with a private tour company that specialized in humorous historical walks through London. His new employer appreciated his ability to engage with tourists, and Marcus had learned to channel his entertaining instincts in ways that enhanced rather than undermined the experiences he was providing. He never used a rubber duck in his presentations, again, but he also never forgot the lesson that Sergeant Hayes had taught him about the importance of respecting the institutions and traditions that made London's history worth sharing. The guard's unwavering commitment to his duties had shown Marcus what true professionalism looked like, even if he had learned that lesson the hard way. The incident at Buckingham Palace became a story that Marcus would sometimes share with other tour guides as an example of how quickly things could go wrong when professional boundaries were crossed. But he always ended the story with gratitude for the harsh but valuable lesson he had learned about the difference between being memorable for the right reasons and being memorable for the wrong ones.